Today we're looking at the novel Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre. The edition that I'm using is this quite common one that you can find in used bookstores everywhere, translated by Lloyd Alexander. And this is a 1938 novel, so this is coming after Sartre has done his philosophical formation, but before he's doing most of the other work that he's going to be famous for. So it's a very early work. It's prefiguring a lot of the major themes that are going to emerge, say, in Being and Nothingness or in the various plays, as we're going to see later on. You see these themes showing up again in Existentialism as a Humanism. A lot took place between the publication of Nausea and Sartre's later works. There's the war, World War II, and a prisoner of war camp for Sartre, which you can read about in his notebooks. Publication of Being and Nothingness, sort of his first really major work, the work of philosophy. This is his first major work of literature. The Occupation, and then, starting to rebuild France after that. So this is set at a time after World War I, which radically changed things for Europeans, to be sure. But before the debacle that comes about with World War II. And it's a story of a man who's troubled at his core. That's why this is a really great way to make your way into Sartre. If existentialism is a humanism, is a good piece of philosophy to introduce Sartre with, this novel, Nausea, is a good one too, because it hits on all the major points. So it's a story about this man who, like I said, is troubled at his core and he's trying to make sense of it. Something has happened to him, and it didn't happen all at once. Not one single occasion, there isn't one primal trauma that he can trace things to. Something has been growing on him over time, and he feels as if something is out of joint. You know how at times you can almost see something out of the corner of your eyes, or you feel as if things just aren't right. You can't quite put your finger on it. You can't articulate precisely what it is that's bothering you. That's what's been going on for this guy for a while. And then he starts having some experiences, and these experiences are in fact the nausea. But not all of them actually turn out to be the nausea, and he ends up telling us, a whole story about what's going on with him as it goes on. Early on in the book, which, by the way, the book is there's sort of an authorial convention. It's being depicted as if these are documents which found their way into an editor's hands. Kierkegaard used to use this sort of dodge all the time. Sartre is using it for this one, but this is really a young Jean-Paul Sartre type of guy writing. And it's being written by, or the main character who's speaking is Antoine Roquentin. And he says, the strangest thing is that I'm not at all inclined to consider myself insane. He's talking about this experience that he had and what's going on with him. I clearly see that I am not. All these changes concern objects. At least that's what I'd like to be sure of. So it's not just that something has changed within him. Something has changed in the world, in experience, in what he is being confronted by. And this extends to the world of objects. So it includes people. But as you notice through the book, people are treated in two very different ways. They're treated as objects that can be described, things that you can sense, you can see, you can hear. And then they're treated as having meaning, as having intentions, as having a sort of way of thinking about things, as having desires. So there's a kind of bifurcation here between, you might say, if you want to be very Cartesian about this, the body and the soul and the mind. Sartre is, in large respect, Cartesian, but he's not, when you get down to it, a Cartesian dualist. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as it goes on in this book. But first, let's think about, well, who is this guy and what's going on with him? And everybody's heard the term existential crisis. It's something that we use nowadays even in sitcoms. But what is an existential crisis? And is Antoine Roquentin having an existential crisis? Is that what this is about? Or is he maybe having a set of crises? Well, this is something worth dwelling on. What is it to have an existential crisis? Oftentimes we talk about that as being a crisis of meaning. Things made sense to us before, and perhaps, you know, midlife crises are sort of this way. Your role, your function changes, your capacities to do things changes. You no longer occupy the same social space, the same familial space, the same space with friends, even the same workspace. And now suddenly your identity is becoming more fluid and up for grabs, and you're not quite sure who you are. Is that what's going on with him? That's worth thinking about. That's often how we depict an existential crisis. People don't know who they are and they have to find themselves. And usually if it's a sitcom, they do so fairly quickly. If it's a movie, you know, it takes about 90 minutes. Well, in a novel, it may not happen at all, because novels don't always have those kind of endings. But he's not actually having an existential crisis just in that sense. Like he says, these changes concern objects. They concern the world as it is around him, as he's immersed in it. The natural world he talks about, you know, trees, the vegetation on the fringes of cities, you know, the countryside, but also the humanized world of cities, intentionality, you know, just shot through at every moment. And then the other parts of the city, where he can talk, for instance, about a train station having, you know, been in a certain place and streetlights sort of blossoming around it using vegetal imagery, where the objects themselves start to take on a kind of life of their own. Usually when we neglect them, usually when we let them alone for a while, they come to take on a character, they come to act in a certain way. But that's how it presents itself to this character. So we're seeing the world, and it's a changed world, actually a world that's changing at several different points. We're seeing the world through his eyes. He's trying to be as attentive as he can. He sets himself that as his goal. So first, let's think about, well, who is this guy? Or what is he? That's part of the central issue going on. Here's the other question. What is happening? What is happening to the world? What is happening to objects? What is happening to other people? So, again, let's think about, well, who is this guy, Roquentin? Interestingly enough, I remember when I was a kid reading this for the first time, you know, back in my freshman year of college, thinking that this guy was middle-aged. He was so old. Turns out that the character is only 30 years old. I'm already 10 years, well, 11 years now, older than this character, who strikes me now as being sort of a young man. That's part of what Sartre will later on call his facticity, how old he is. What else do we know about him in that way? What else are characteristics of him? We know he's got red hair. That comes up several times. We know he's not particularly good looking, or at least we can surmise that from certain things that he says. We know that he has traveled around the world to many different places. If you lay down the entire itinerary, that would take quite a while. You can say he's been in Asia, he's been in Indochina, China, Japan, he's been all over Europe, he's been to Russia, he's been to North Africa, he's been to the Middle East, and he spent a lot of time there. Now he's in a town called Beauville, or Beauville, if you like. What else do we know about him? Well, at the start, if you just read a few pages, you think, well, this guy, all he does is hang around in bars and cafes all the time. But actually, he's got a project. His project is to write a book. And he's been gathering materials and doing research and thinking about these things and starting, to write and putting things together, chapters, gradually working out this whole project. And he's writing a book on this guy, the Marquis de Rollerball. So a historical figure. He studied him previously, he has all sorts of materials gathered, and he spends his time sifting through this. So he spends his time basically at night in the cafes, and by day oftentimes in a reading room, doing some reading, thinking, working. So he's got this, pretty ordinary life. Job, doing something else, sleeping, hanging out in his room, or going to the bars. He tells us later on, this is deep in the book, I have no troubles. I have money like a capitalist, no boss, no wife, no children. I exist, that's all. And that trouble is so vague, so metaphysical, that I am ashamed of it. So he does have a trouble. He does have some sort of crisis going on, or a set of crises, or a malady, or some sort of interior disquiet. But he says it's a metaphysical one. A lot of other people, they've got what we would call real problems, right? I mean, for the person suffering an existential crisis, it's real. Oftentimes we say, if you had some real problems, you wouldn't worry about all this philosophy stuff. If you're taking care of somebody who's terminally ill, or if you have a child who's constantly getting in trouble, or even if the child who's doing great and you're happy they're not in trouble, or you are carrying on some criminal enterprise and trying to avoid getting caught, or you're at war, there's all sorts of different possibilities here. You're committed, you're in a situation, you have a meaning that overflows you, that gives you a stable sense of who you are. Although even then, things can break down, and people do, in fact, arrive at points where they say, I don't know who I am anymore, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what the point of all this is. What is the change that takes place? Is it the nausea? It's not exactly the nausea. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. This leads us to something, leads us to a point where I want to note something a little bit more fully that I brought up. I said just a few minutes ago that Sartre depicts people in two different ways. He depicts them as objects to be sensed and then described. So he talks about people's hands, for example, or his own hand. By the way, he's not just objectifying other people in this way, he's also objectifying himself when he looks in the mirror. He doesn't really like to look at his own image in the mirror. He finds it unfamiliar. And some of his descriptions of people, they sort of break down into all these different sense impressions that have meaning, but not the kind of human meaning that we're used to. They were more sort of organic, animal, vegetal, even mineral meaning. Distinctively human meaning, or sense, involves intentions, involves interpretations of what's going on, involves putting labels on things, and choosing, using one's freedom, acting in a determinate manner for some purpose, with something in mind. Also sort of reflexive self-defining. I am this, I am that, as opposed to that. Sartre writes about all of that, and those two things are kind of fused together in his work. So one of the things that I'd like to say at this point is, if we look at Sartre just in terms of his artistry as a novelist, as a literary figure, before we actually get into the philosophical meat of it, so I'm not going to do a lot of literary analysis here. I'm more interested in the philosophical kernel that we can draw from this. What we can say is that when it comes to description, Sartre is incredibly astute. It helps that he had studied phenomenology. Again, we're delving into philosophy here. Phenomenology is a movement, a style, an approach within philosophy that consists in large part of paying very close attention to what is actually being experienced by a person, and then noting that, describing it, and trying to avoid interjecting interpretations or classifications or anything like that until you've actually got clear about what it is that is being presented to you. Sartre is doing a very good job with those sorts of descriptions. And as I reread this, I was just struck by how much artistry goes into his descriptions of train stations, of streets, of the way people move, of the way people hold themselves, of the back of a bar, of the food that's put in front of him. Just really amazing powers of description there. Part of what's going on in that, in some of these descriptions, they're so synesthetically tied together. That means that information from one sense, like sight, is being made sense of through another sense, say sound, or touch, or pressure, or anything along those lines. So music takes on a brittleness, a metallicness, all those sorts of things. We normally do speak in those terms. That's what we call synesthesia. There's a particular kind of synesthesia which can sort of get out of hand, associational, moving from one thing to the next very, very quickly, things breaking apart, that you sometimes see in psychotic discourse. And Sartre gets very close to that at certain points in here. Part of what's going on when he has the nausea, when he has this experience, is things become very unfamiliar to him, things that he's used to sensing. The meaning is still flooding him, but he's having a hard time making sense of it, being able to figure out what's actually going on. And it kind of repulses him or frightens him. What else is going on in the book? Well, from a literary perspective, another great strength of Sartre is in presenting dialogue and soliloquies. He has a lot of different little conversations between people, and there's really nothing, you could say, artificial about them. They're often rather philosophical, and yet they fit. They make sense in the framework of this novel. So that's a good thing. There are also quite a few what are essentially soliloquies, where the narrator is recounting his story. Is it clear who he's recounting it to? Is he recounting it to us? Is he recounting it to himself? He's trying to, again, make sense out of things. Sartre is quite good at inserting that sort of thing. So this is, Sartre, a lot of his literature is quite good. Now let's shift to start to talk more about these characters and the philosophical meaning of what's going on with them. So one place to start is what we can call the problem of Rocha, this courtier who Roquentin is writing about, who's trying to understand through this book. And if you think about, I'm going to quote quite a few passages from the book because it's hard to make sense of literature without doing that. Now he's been studying him for quite a while, and he says, in the first place, starting from 1801, I understand nothing more about his conduct. It's not the lack of documents, letters, fragments of memoirs, secret reports, police records. On the contrary, I have almost too many of them. What is lacking in all this testimony is firmness and consistency. They do not contradict each other. they contradicted each other, you could, this is an aside, you could simply reject some of them and then, you know, have a core set of documents to work from. Neither do they agree with each other. They do not seem to be about the same person. Yet other historians work from the same sources of information. How do they do it? Am I more scrupulous or less intelligent? In any case, the question leaves me completely cold. In truth, what am I looking for? I don't know. So he has reached a sort of moment of crisis, at least with the respect of what he's doing, writing on this guy who he, you know, thought, well, this is something I can do. This is something I am good at. This is a project I can put myself into. Look, I've got all this material I can work with. I can at least get to the bottom of this. I may not, you know, solve the great mysteries of the universe. I may actually, you know, not get married, have children, but at least I can do this. I can write a book. Well, it turns out that at least when it has to do with the essence of a human being, it's not quite so easy to do that. And you could probably say this about a lot of other people as well if you start digging into their stories. One side note that's kind of interesting too, where did he get these documents from? He tells us later on, he actually stole these documents from the Soviet Union. So this is stuff that really matters to him. For a historian to actually steal documents from archives, that's important stuff there. Later on, as he's considering the issue about how am I going to make sense of this guy, he says that Roquentin resists certainty. He makes it hard for him to be pinned down. He says, I could imagine him so well if I let myself go. Now notice he's talking about imagining him. Beneath his brilliant irony, which made so many victims, he was simple, almost naive. He thinks little, but at all times, by a profound intuition, he does exactly what should be done. His rascality is candid, spontaneous, generous, as sincere as his love of virtue, and when he betrays his benefactors and friends, he turns back gravely to the events and draws a moral from them. He never thought he had the slightest right over others any more than others over him. He goes on with this. This is a very attractive character, isn't it? And he says, but if this is where it all leads me, I'd be better off writing a novel. Not a book, not a piece of history, not something that purports to actually tell who this person was, but make the person a fictional character in a novel. Eventually he gets himself to the point where he has to abandon his project of writing on Roquentin. He says, this is again where he's going through his crisis. How can I, who have not the strength to hold to my own past, hope to save the past of somebody else? He starts to realize that what he's been doing, and we all do this, you know, anyone who's a historian or somebody, you know, who sort of unpacks a philosophical figure, we all do this in a way. We're all trying to sort of bring back to life something which has passed away. It's kind of, you know, kind of an ironic thing to think about. He's talking again still about trying to write, and he says, as my eyes fell on the pad of white sheets, I was struck by his look, and I stayed pen raised, studying this dazzling paper, so hard and far-seeing, so present. The letters I had just inscribed on it were not even dry yet, and already they belonged to the past. So I'm trying to write about this person who's long past, and the past that he lived in present moments that keep on slipping away into the past. And when I'm done, if I have a book, that will just be a sort of a congelation of past moments. And this strikes him as being kind of futile. He can't find meaning there anymore. It's at this point, actually, he says, that the true nature of the present revealed itself. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. And he ends up saying to himself, I'm going to have to give up on this. I can't write about this guy. I can't continue this as my main project, he says. Monsieur de Roquentin was my partner. He needed me in order to exist, and I needed him so as not to feel my existence. So carrying out this project was a way for Roquentin to not feel his existence, to not be troubled by his existence, to avoid dealing with the crisis. So now let's actually look at these crises. And then we'll look at some characters and how they fit in this. What do we know about the nausea? Well, I mean, Sartre never actually stops for a moment and says, okay, here's exactly what I mean by the nausea. Now, it happened again here, and it happened again here, and it happened again here. But here's the essence of it. Instead, what he does is he tells us about it at several different points. He tells us times when he has it, times when he doesn't have it, and we have to kind of put the picture together in a composite way. So let's actually look at some of the occasions where this occurs. Early on in the book, he says, things are bad, things are very bad. I have it, the filth, the nausea. And this time it is new, it is caught in a cafe. Up until this point, he's been suffering it, but not in cafes, not in places where people are gathered. He says, until now, cafes were my only refuge. Then the nausea seized me. I dropped to a seat. I no longer knew where I was. I saw the colors spin slowly around me. I wanted to vomit. And since that time, the nausea has not left me. It holds me. That's a description of what's happened to him. What is the nausea actually like? Well, he says he's coming to actually have sex with the owner of the cafe, and the waitress says, she's not here, she's shopping. And he says, I felt a sharp disappointment in the sexual parts, a long disagreeable tickling. Okay, understandable, right? At the same time, I felt my shirt rubbing against my breast, and I was surrounded, seized by a slow-colored mist and a whirlpool of lights in the smoke, in the mirrors, in the booths, glowing at the back of the cafe. And I couldn't see why it was there, or why it was like that. So, this is not just a thing that's occurring within his body, feeling nauseous, feeling like he's going to throw up, being sick. It has to do with his sense perception. It has to do with his grasp on the world. That's what's actually making him feel sick. Things come unglued, things flow, is how he often describes these sorts of things. He's talking about this guy Adolphe, and he's watching him, and he says, his blue cotton shirt stands out joyfully against a chocolate-colored wall. That too brings on the nausea. Here's where he says something very interesting. The nausea is not inside me. I feel it out there, in the wall, in the suspenders, everywhere around me. It makes itself one with the cafe. I am the one who is in it. So, again, this is not just being sick, and it's not just stimulus response. This is coming through in the very way in which he is perceiving the world. The nausea is out there to be perceived by him in the world. It's not something that's a purely subjective reaction on his part. Instead, this is a revelation for Sartre of sort of unmediated reality. Let's look at another discussion. A little bit later on, he talks about the nausea going away. Why does it go away? He says, the nausea stay down there in the yellow light. I'm happy, is when he's walking around outside. This cold is so pure, this night so pure, am I myself not a wave of icy air with neither blood nor lymph nor flesh, to be nothing but coldness. So one thing that keeps the nausea at bay is very simple, almost mineral, he'll say later on, mineral-like, abstract ways of existing. A little bit later on, or a little bit before that, sorry, he loses the nausea as well momentarily, listens to a record, a jazz record, which is being played at the cafe. And he says, what has just happened is that the nausea has disappeared. When the voice was heard in the silence, I felt my body harden and the nausea vanish. Suddenly it was almost unbearable to become so hard, so brilliant. And he's not talking about, sexual arousal or anything like that. He's talking about something more like having definite contours. Things like everything having its place, and things being almost brittle in the way in which they stand out against each other. So from everything sliding into everything else, and losing its sort of outlines and consistency, to moments where everything is totally clear, but almost kind of static. Those are the two poles that he goes between. A little bit later on, he talks about something which is like the nausea, but is not quite it. One of the themes that we're going to hit on soon is adventure, he says. Nothing has changed, and yet everything is different. I can't describe it. It's like the nausea, and yet it's just the opposite. So there is a state which is like the nausea, but is not the nausea, and is in a certain way, not necessarily like its polar opposite, but certainly changes the world around him and its meaning in a way that's not that of the nausea. At last an adventure happens to me, and when I question myself, I see that I am myself and I am here. I am the one who splits the night. I am as happy, is a beautiful phrase. I am as happy as the hero of a novel. So we're saying this in a novel, right? Something is going to happen, something is waiting for me. In the shadow of the Rue Bastille, it is over there just at the corner of this calm street that my life is going to begin. And I think we've all had that sort of feeling at one time or another. He's writing about things we can really relate to. And just like the nausea, which is out there in the world, and is not just, like I said, a matter of stimulus coming to us and then we have a subjective response, but rather our perception of what it is out there. This is another way of perceiving the world. The world is opening itself up, and things are there for me, and I am there for it, and something is going to happen. That's part of the essence of adventure for him. He says several times, a thing is waiting for me at the end of the Place du Coton. He walks some more, There is also at the Place du Coton at the end of the Rue Tournebreed something which needs me in order to come to life. I am full of anguish. The slightest movement irks me. I can't imagine what they want with me, yet I must choose. And it turns out to be something fairly trivial. And so he says nothing was left other than regret after that. But this is something that gives us a good contrast to the nausea. Later on, he runs into another character who he says has the nausea. We're going to look at him in a moment. A little bit further, this is very interesting. He says, not only can the nausea happen to people, it can actually happen to the world. He talks about a case like that, he says. He's talking about what happens in a room full of bookshelves. Today, they've fixed nothing at all. It seemed that their very existence was subject to doubt, bookshelves. But they had the greatest difficulty in passing from one instant to the next. I held the book I was reading tightly in my hands, but the most violent sensations went dead. Nothing seemed true. I felt surrounded by cardboard scenery which could quickly be removed. The world was waiting, holding its breath, making itself small. It was waiting for its convulsion, its nausea, just like Monsieur Achille the other day. So it's not just people that can suffer this sort of shifting, this almost iridescence of fixed meaning starting to gel and flow away, and things transmuting into each other unpredictably. The world itself can be concerned with that, you might say. Later on, he asks himself, is he having the nausea? And interestingly, he says, an immense sickness flooded over me. Suddenly the pen fell from my hands, spluttering ink. What happened? Did I have the nausea? No, it wasn't that. The room had its paternal everyday look, so he's not having that sort of sense disorder. The table hardly seemed heavier and more solid to me, nor my pen more compact. Only Monsieur de Rollebon died for the second time. This is after he has a sort of metaphysical realization about things. He was, and I should actually read a little bit further. He was still there inside me a little while ago, quiet and warm, and I could feel him stir from time to time. He was quite alive. He undoubtedly had his whims. He could stay several days without showing himself, but often on a mysteriously fine day, like a weather prophet, he put his nose out and I could see his pale face and bluish cheeks. Nothing more was left now. No more than on these traces of dry ink is left the memory of their freshness. Suddenly, noiseless, the Marquis de Rollebon had returned to his nothingness. So you can have these sort of experiences without all of the world shifting and realigning that way. You can also have that sort of physical sickness because something else occurs. He has another bout of the nausea, the strongest yet, this time revealing the nature of existence to him. Well, he is at lunch with the self-taught man, and he leaves, and he goes eventually into a park, and in that park he comes to an understanding of what the nausea actually is. So this is a good place to wrap up this thread, he says. This moment was extraordinary. I was there, motionless and icy, plunged into a horrible ecstasy. But something fresh had just appeared in the very heart of this ecstasy. I understood the nausea. I possessed it. To tell the truth, I did not formulate my discoveries to myself, but I think it would be easy for me to put them into words now. The essential thing is contingency. I mean that one cannot define existence as necessity. To exist is simply to be there. Those who let themselves exist, let themselves be encountered, but you can never deduce anything from them. So, along with the affective, sensory experience of the nausea goes a metaphysical insight into the existence of things, the nature of things. These permeate each other. These are two sides of the same coin. This is a good place now, before we actually try to look at that directly, to look at a few of the characters who are involved in this novel, besides Roquentin, and see some of their relationships with him. So by far the one who gets the most space is the self-taught man. And, in French, it's autodidact. The autodidact, the person who has taught himself what's going on. We're going to look at him in a moment, but who else matters? Who else are sort of pivotal points where you might say almost like lighthouses by which we can chart our path, by which Roquentin charts his path? There's the self-made man. There's another character, the Corsican, who I'm not going to talk about, who gets in conflicts with the self-made man, particularly towards the end. Then there's Monsieur Achille. And there's a broad category of the, I just write this wrong. There we go. The bourgeoisie, the bourgeois characters. And the best representative of them, the one who we're going to focus on here, is Dr. Rocha. Then there's another character who's very important as well, Annie, but I don't want to put her up here quite now. I want to wrap up by looking at her, because something different is going on there. So there's a lot of other characters involved in this. There's, the people at the bars, the cafes. Some of them actually have, little crises of their own. Roquentin at one time runs into two of them where the man looks like to be leaving the woman who is imploring him tearfully. But I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on these three, in part because they have to do with what the novel is really about and what Roquentin is struggling with. So actually, before we get to the self-taught man, let's look at the interplay between bourgeois and Achille. First, though, let's look at the bourgeois. There's three main parts where Sartre really dwells on this. And he's, it's sort of traditional thing for French literary figures, unless they're actually defending the bourgeois, to attack the bourgeois for all sorts of things. We do that too in our literary stuff. But they represent something in particular for Sartre. And he talks about them on the Sunday that he goes out into town, on this particular road. He talks about them in terms of the gallery at the museum, and then he also talks about this Dr. Rocha. So let's look at what happens that Sunday. He goes out, and I'm just going to read a few short passages from this. He is on the Rue Josephine-Soulary, and on the Rue Tournebreed. All these people are coming out on Sunday, and they're engaged in this process, this dance almost, of social niceties. They're engaging with each other, they're tipping their hats to each other, they're walking, there's certain protocol for all of these things. They're engaging as well in some one-upmanship and some patron-protege interactions, all those sorts of things as well. And Sartre is not particularly fond of this, but he does depict it very well. And he shows all these people sort of at play on a Sunday, engaged in these things that they think matter. And that's really the heart of it. The bourgeois go wrong by thinking that the things that they encounter in their world are the way things must be. That they have definite essences, and things are the way that they should be in this case. And it sort of sets up its own kind of micro-universe, its own social universe, in which they have the right to be, and they have the right to be exactly as they are. Same thing comes up as well when he is talking, and there's a very long passage about the museum. And I just want to focus on one character in this museum, Remy Perrotin. There are all these different pictures there, and in all these different pictures, well, I'm going to read you a little bit of one of them. Portraiture is supposed to show the essence of the person, right? So this portrait painter did a good job, and Roquentin is in there and he's looking at one of these, and he says, "His judgment went through me like a sword and questioned my very right to exist." And it was true. I had always realized that I hadn't the right to exist. I had appeared by chance. I existed like a stone, a plant, or a microbe. But for this handsome, faultless man now dead, for Jean-Paul, it had been an entirely different matter. The beating of his heart, the mute rumbling of his organs, in his case, assumed the form of rights to be instantly obeyed. For 60 years, without a halt, he had used his right to live. The slightest doubt had never crossed those magnificent gray eyes. Pacome had never made a mistake. He had always done his duty, all his duty as a son, husband, father, leader. He had never weakened in his demands for his due. So what you have here in the bourgeois universe are these people who have a sort of mechanism of social life that they're committed to, they feel very confident about. It helps to keep all of the uncertainties, all of the worries, all of the anxiety at bay. You can't picture them actually having nausea, if the sort of nausea that Sartre does. And if they did, well, then you lock them up in an asylum. And even if they have strange ideas, well, that's where this other guy comes in, Remy Parotin. Why was he loved? Why did he have his prestige? He was loved because he understood everything. You could tell him anything. Socialists, well, I go further than they do. When you followed him down this perilous road, you were soon to leave behind, not without a shiver, family, country, private property rights, and the most sacred values. You even doubted for a second the right of the bourgeois elite to command. Another step, and suddenly everything was reestablished, miraculously founded on solid reason, good old reasons. You turned around and you saw the socialists already far behind you, all waving, all tiny, waving their handkerchiefs and shouting, "Wait for us." So Remy Parotin is a philosopher, essentially. He takes, young men who are having their own little crises, and he breaks everything down, sort of like a Descartes, right? And then he builds it all back up on solid reasons, and it happens to be the reasons of the bourgeois. It all makes sense. It doesn't work for Sartre or for Roquentin. Let's look at Dr. Rocha now. Dr. Rocha comes into a bar where Roquentin has had a contact with Monsieur Achille. And he comes in, he's sort of larger than life, here's how Sartre describes him. He's a professional and experienced. Doctors, priests, magistrates, and army officers know men through and through as if they had made them. And he calls Mr. Achille a loon, sort of dismissing him. He judges him. He categorizes him. Sartre goes on to describe him some more. He says, "They would like to make us believe that the past is not lost, that their memories are condensed, gently transformed into wisdom. Convenient past handed out of the pocket, little gilt books full of fine sayings. Believe me, I'm telling you from experience, all I know I've learned from life. They explain the new by the old, and the old they explain by the older still. Like those historians who turn a Lenin into a Russian Robespierre, or Robespierre into a French Cromwell. When all is said and done, they've never understood anything at all." So Dr. Rocha is the type of person to come in and categorize. And he's drawing on a prestige that comes about because he's a great man of the world and he's been successful and he's built up all this experience. What Sartre is finding fault with him for is for taking the dead past and projecting its categories onto the present. So it makes the world in which he lives almost like sort of a mausoleum or a museum full of, they didn't have it at the time, freeze-dried specimens is what we have in our museums. And it causes other people to have to choose whether they're going to participate in this or not. So this gets us to Monsieur Achille. Monsieur Achille is actually somebody who is having something similar to what Roquentin is. And he says, the little man stirs and sighs. Here he is looking at me again. This time he's going to speak to me. And I feel all taut inside. There's no sympathy between us. We are alike, that's all. He is alone as I am, but more sunken into solitude than I. He must be waiting for his own nausea or something of that sort. Dr. Rocha comes in, and then he sort of jokingly says about, Monsieur Achille, you let people like that in here? And then he says, he's crazy as a loon, that's that. What happens then? Well, Monsieur Achille has to make a decision, and he decides what Roquentin or Sartre thinks is the wrong way. He says, there it is, the man smiles with humility, a crazy loon, he relaxes. He feels protected against himself. Nothing will happen to him today. The nausea is gone. I am reassured too. A crazy old loon. So that was it. That was all. Monsieur Achille is probably happier than he has ever been. He is agape with admiration of the bourgeois. The doctor knew how to take him. The doctor wasn't one to let himself be hypnotized by an old madman on the verge of having his fit. One good blow, a few rough lashing words, that's what they need. And Sartre says, I am ashamed for Monsieur Achille. We are on the same side. We should have stood up against them, against the bourgeois. But it's hard to do that, isn't it? I mean, this is the sort of thing, this experience, where there is a commonality there, but it's not the kind of commonality that draws people together. It's not as if existentialists could have, at least Sartrean existentialists, a great amount of solidarity. He says, we are on the same side, we should have stood up against him. But he left me, he went over to theirs. He honestly believes in experience. Not in his, not in mine, in Dr. Rocha's. A little while ago, Monsieur Achille felt queer, he felt lonely. Now he knows there are others like him, many others. Dr. Rocha has met them. He can tell Monsieur Achille the case history of each one of them and tell him how they ended up. Monsieur Achille is simply a case, and he lets himself be brought back easily to the accepted ideas. How would I like to tell him? How I would like to tell him he's being deceived. He is the butt of an important. Experienced professionals, they've dragged out their life in stupor and semi-sleep. They lived at random, essentially. Say. What about the autodidact, the self-taught man? This character gets developed in a lot more depth. What is his project? Well, he actually is in the reading room, and he's trying to, this is his self-education, he's trying to read through everything in alphabetical order. And he ever so often writes down some maxim, some idea that catches his eye, and now he's accumulating knowledge. And he has the feeling that if he just keeps at it, he's going to eventually exhaust the realm of knowledge there, and he'll finally be educated, he'll finally be ready. And this is a very strange way of doing things, isn't it? But this is what he's up to. And you can tell the kind of attitude that he has towards things by this really interesting encounter that he has with Roquentin, where he says, I distrust myself so much, one should have read everything. And then after that, the idea is if it's not in a book, it's not true. Later on, he expresses himself, and he asks if that's in any book that Roquentin has read, and he said, I don't think so. And then he said, well, I must be wrong then. If it's not in a book, if it was true, somebody else would have figured it out and would have written it down, and it would be in a book. It's not in a book, I must be wrong. He's doubting himself. He's doubting his own capacity to bring about something new, something interesting, something worthwhile. At the same time, what is motivating him? He has a secret desire to have something that he calls adventures. They go and they look at photographs together. And what does he want to do after having all of these this education? He says, when I finish my instruction, I allow 6 more years for that, I shall join, if I permitted, the group of students and professors who take an annual cruise to the Near East. I should like to make some new acquaintances. To speak frankly, I should also like to something unexpected to happen to me, something new, adventures. What sort of adventures? I ask him, astonished. All sorts, monsieur. Getting on the wrong train, stopping in an unknown city, losing your briefcase, being arrested by mistake, spending the night in prison. Monsieur, I believe the word adventure could be defined as an event out of the ordinary without being necessarily extraordinary. People speak of the magic of adventures. Does this expression seem correct to you? I would like to ask you a question, monsieur. Have you had many adventures? And this is a very important point, because Roquentin will actually reflect on things, and he'll end up saying to this man, I have had many adventures. But he will end up saying later, I've never actually had any adventures. Remember though, the nausea itself, the state that was similar to it, was a state a little bit later on in the novel where he feels like he's on the verge of having an adventure. So this notion of adventure, the self-made man and Roquentin have that in common. That's something that motivates them. That's something that is common to their way of understanding time. We're going to get to that a little bit more in the second installment of this when we look at Roquentin's own sense of time. Right now we're just sort of exploring his relation to the self-taught man, who the self-taught man is. The real crux that occurs between them, it's not actually at the end of the book. The self-taught man, turns out, is also a pedophile. And he gets caught by the Corsican. The Corsican has been watching him for some time. And the self-taught man is trying to touch these young boys who sort of have been daring each other to go screw with him, essentially, to put themselves in his way, and he's touching them sort of discreetly, but where his desire is very clear, and he gets kicked out. That's not the real culmination. That's sort of the anticlimax. The really important thing that happens between these two guys is a lunch that takes place. The self-taught man invites Roquentin to lunch, and he wants to communicate something to him. Now, these aren't just people out on the street. These are people who have been in the same reading room for quite a while. They've shared a few confidences. They've shared the same space, the same time at least, but their interpretations of it are very different. This is an occasion, an incident within it that's very important for Sartre's philosophy. And so you can see Roquentin by contrast to the self-taught man, and in a sort of conflict with the self-taught man, going way beyond what happens with Achille and Dr. Rocha. So he says, what happens first is the self-taught man, they're sitting there and they're looking around the room, and Roquentin says, what a comedy. All those people sitting there looking serious, eating. No, they aren't eating. They're recuperating in order to successfully finish their tasks. Each of them has this little personal difficulty which keeps him from noticing that he exists. There isn't one of them who doesn't believe himself indispensable to something or someone. Each one of them does one small thing, and no one is better qualified than he to do it. No one's better qualified than the commercial traveler over there to sell Swan toothpaste. No one is better qualified than that interesting young man to put his hand under his girlfriend's skirts. And I am among them, and if they look at me, they must think that no one is better qualified than I to do what I'm doing. But I know. I don't look like much, but I know I exist and that they exist. And if I knew how to convince people, I'd go and sit down next to that handsome white-haired gentleman and explain to him just what existence means. He bursts out laughing then. So the self-taught man says, what are you laughing about? He says, I was just thinking that here we sit, all of us eating and drinking to preserve our precious existence, and really there's nothing, absolutely no reason for existing. So the self-taught man becomes serious. He makes an effort to understand me. I laugh too loud. He repeats slowly, no reason for existing? You undoubtedly mean, monsieur, that life is without a goal. Isn't that what one might call pessimism? He thinks for a moment and then says gently, a few years ago I read a book by an American author. It was called, Is Life Worth Living? Isn't that the question you're asking yourself? And Sartre says to himself in an aside, certainly not, that is not the question I'm asking myself, but I have no desire to explain. And I'm going to pause here for a moment. I think we've all had this experience of having something that we're thinking out and feeling out at the same time. It's not just cognitive, it's also affective, and we don't fully have our heads wrapped around it. It may be because it's too complex, or because it touches on deep metaphysical roots, or because we haven't lingered with it long enough. We haven't unpacked all of it. We haven't looked at it from all the different sides that we need to. And somebody wants to call us on the spot and say, penny for your thoughts. And we're supposed to tell them what's on our mind. You know, and we've all had the experience of these sort of trivialities of human exchange when we're trying to grapple with something like that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, massive, Sartrean existential crisis. It can be, when you are grieving, somebody comes up to you, and grief is a mystery as well. You're grieving, and they want to talk to you about stuff. And you're willing to talk with them because you're not a jerk, but you can't communicate with them. You can't get across what it is that's on your mind. And they may actually want to know what's on your mind. And then they make guesses at it, and they say things here and there. And you're like, no, that's not it. That's what's going on in this passage. So he says, the self-taught man says, his conclusion is in favor of voluntary optimism. Life has a meaning if we choose to give it one. One must first act, throw oneself into some enterprise. Then if one reflects, the die is already cast, one is pledged. I don't know what you think about that, monsieur. Roquentin says, nothing. And then what's going on in his head is he says, rather, I think that's precisely the sort of lie that the commercial traveler, the two young people, and the man with the white hair tell themselves. That if you just find something to do, to care about, to be preoccupied with, now your life has meaning. This is, a philosophical position. This is what some people have, in fact, advocated. It's not just, optimists and self-help therapists and people along those lines who have said these sort of things. There are actual philosophers out there who have advocated that sort of approach to life as a healthy approach to life. Now the self-made man doesn't buy that. He says, neither is it my opinion. I do not think we need to look so far to know the direction our life should take. There is a goal, monsieur. There is a goal. There is humanity. And then Sartre says, that's right. I forgot. He was a humanist. He remained silent for a moment, long enough to make the most of his spiced beef and a whole slice of bread disappear cleanly and inexorably. There are people. He has just painted a whole picture of himself, the philanthropist. Yes, but he doesn't know quite how to express himself. He's a crude humanist, he says. A naive and barbaric provincial humanist, right? Sartre says, you don't seem particular, or Roquentin says, you don't seem particularly concerned with people. You're always alone, always with your nose in a book. He says, monsieur, you're wrong. Allow me to tell you so. What an error. I've been waiting for the opportunity to tell you this, he says. And then, there's a bit of back and forth compliments going on. And he talks about this experience that he had during the war, in a prisoner of war camp. They were all herded into this gigantic barn, and they're all sort of crammed in there together. And he felt suddenly sort of on an animal level at one with everybody else around him. And that changed him. So he says, after that, in the year of my liberation, I spent many miserable months. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was wasting away. Whenever I saw men together, I would insert myself into their group. But I found my vocation. What is his vocation? He's a socialist. I've been a member of the Socialist Party since the month of September 1921. That is what I wanted to tell you. That was his deep, dark secret. And now, why is he a socialist? He says, I don't feel alone by being a socialist. Now, what Sartre ends up talking about here is humanism and what he sees as its kind of traps, its deficits, its inadequacies. And so this man, the self-taught man, is in effect a humanist. He says, what can I do? Is it my fault if in all he tells me I recognize the lack of the genuine article. Is it my fault if, as he speaks, I see all the humanists I have known rise up? I have known so many of them. The radical humanist, so there's one. The radical humanist is the particular friend of officials. The so-called left humanist mean worry is keeping human values. He belongs to no party because he does not want to betray the human, but his sympathies go towards the humble. He consecrates his beautiful classic culture to the humble. He is generally a widower with a fine eye, always clouded with tears. We know people like that, right? Sentimentalists, we would call them. They're always, on the side of the downtrodden. And Sartre is actually saying here, there's something a little hinky with that. The communist writer has been loving men since the second 5-year plan. He's supposed to. He punishes because he loves. Modest is all strong. Many knows how to hide his feelings, but he also knows by a look and inflection of his voice how to recognize behind his rough and ready justicial utterances his passion for the brethren. So we've got the radical leftist humanist, sentimentalist essentially, the communist, and remember these are not communists here in the United States. These are communists who actually have a chance of getting power. But communism was devoted to some sort of humanist ideas, that it was benefiting humanity. The Catholic humanist, the latecomer, the Benjamin, speaks of men with a marvelous air. What a beautiful fairy tale, says he, is the humble life of a London dockhand, the girl in the shoe factory. He has chosen the humanism of the angels. He writes for their edification long, sad, and beautiful novels which frequently win the Prix Femina. Those are the principal roles. So, radical humanist, communist, Catholic. But there are others, a swarm of others. The humanist philosopher who bends over his brothers like a wise elder brother, who has a sense of his responsibilities. The humanist who loves men as they are. The humanist who loves men as they ought to be. The one who wants to save them with their consent, and the one who will save them in spite of themselves. The one who wants to create new myths, and the one who is satisfied with the old ones. The one who loves death in man, the one who loves life in man. The happy humanist always has the right word to make people laugh. The sober humanist who you meet, especially at funerals or wakes, they all hate each other, he says, as individuals, naturally not as men, because, of course, as men, as human beings, they're all supposed to love each other. But what they love is some sort of abstract conception of what humanity is, not genuine human beings who don't actually know who the hell they are, and are all mixed up, and are this chiaroscuro, not a Sartre word, but light and darkness mix all in together, and oftentimes are inexplicable to themselves. The self-taught man doesn't know it. He's locked them all up inside himself like cats in a bag, and they're tearing each other in pieces without his noticing it. The education that the self-made man has been providing himself is largely a humanistic education. And he's trying to mix together all of these figures, all of whom do express some sort of love for human beings, or admiration, or respect, or care, or pick whatever you like, but do so in different ways, and can't tell you about real, living, present human life, is what Sartre is saying. So he said all this about this guy, and now there's another important movement that takes place. He asked Sartre why he's writing, or he asked Roquentin why he's writing, and he says, "I don't know. I just write. I'm not sure I have a reason." And the self-made man, like he says, he asks little from me, simply to accept the label. He's trying things on. He's trying to fit Sartre into the classification system that he's developed. It is a trap. If I consent, the self-taught man wins. I am immediately turned round, reconstituted, overtaken, for humanism takes possession and melts all human attitudes into one. If you oppose him head on, you play his game. He lives off his opponents. There is a race of beings, limited and headstrong, who lose to him every time He digests all their violences and worst excesses. He makes a white frothy nymph of them. So many other people allow themselves to be categorized by him because they don't know better. But to truly exist for Sartre as a human being means to refuse others' attempts to categorize you and to refuse your own temptation to buy into those categorizations. He says, I don't want to be integrated. I will not be fool enough to call myself anti-humanist. Why not? Well, if you define yourself as just anti-something, or you define yourself as the good guy against the bad guy, you're still defining yourself. You're still imposing these categories on raw existence. Then they have this discussion about hate and love. And Sartre's character, Roquentin, says, who do you actually love? Who are you fooling? I mean, you don't love the people around here. Look at this cafe. What can you tell me about these people? If you actually love them, you'd actually know something about them. And he's, you know, the self-taught man can't tell him much. He says, you see, you don't love them. You wouldn't recognize them in the street. They're only symbols in your eyes. You're not at all touched by them. You're touched by the youth of man, the love of man or woman, the human voice. Well, doesn't that exist? The self-taught man says. And again, you know, very bookish. And Sartre espouses a nominalist attitude here. He says, no, those things don't exist. What exists is this, and this, and this, and that person over there, and that person over there. There's no such thing as the love of man, or any of these sorts of things on their own. He says, it doesn't exist, neither youth, nor maturity, nor old age, nor death. So Sartre is going on the attack here now. And what ends up happening is he leaves. Their encounter is over.